Tom Green was born in Ottawa, Canada, and began delving into stand-up while still in high school. However, he shifted into radio show style comedy where he would participate in prank call culture popularized by figures like Longmont Potion Castle, developing an early sense of the absurdity and anti-structure that would later define his work. His real claim to fame wouldn't begin until the creation of The Tom Green Show in 1994, which aired on Rogers Television 22, based out of Ottawa, Ontario. The show focused on a surreal sketches and pranked street interviews, a sort of precursor to the American Eric Andre show. It was edgy, vulgar, and pushed the limits of what was allowed on television at the time, often featuring uncomfortable and really absurd humor that blurred the line between performance art and public disruption. Green's willingness to embarrass himself, whether through bizarre physical comedy, invasive interviews, or destructive antics, created a style that felt unpredictable and genuinely dangerous compared to conventional comedies. The show was picked up by City TV's Comedy Central channel in 1997 and ran for 2 seasons until 1999, gaining a cult following and eventually crossing over into the American market through MTV, which it reached a much larger audience and further amplified its influence. Tom Green would go on to make waves in the United States, with his most well-known project being a feature film called Freddy Got Fingered in 2001, a film that is widely criticized but has since even gone down as a bit of a cult classic, with the people reevaluating it as a kind of anti-comedy masterpiece that was meant as a sort of middle finger to the studio. He would also create one of the first ever podcasts interviewing celebrities and comedians, inspiring figures like Joe Rogan to develop podcast superpowers and helping legitimize the format long before it became mainstream. However, a career like Tom's could only come from the Canadian television scene of the late 90s. Unlike the United States, which was very cautious not to upset certain groups by being too profane and offensive, Canadian television has far fewer censorship rules at the time, particularly on public access. Because of this, there was more room for artistic expression and experimentation, allowing creators like Green to take risks that would have likely been shut down in more tightly controlled markets. This media ecosystem would make ways for one of the most unique and influential television programs in Western history.
Since the beginning of time, mankind has been forced to compete for survival. This spirit of competition has reached a pinnacle in the relationship of two best friends who battle against each other. Why? Glory for the winner, humiliation for the loser. This is Kenny versus Spenny.
Kenny vs. Spenny was a Canadian show which first aired on CBC but shortly thereafter moved to Showcase in the early 2000s. The premise featured two friends who would compete against each other over stupid challenges. These challenges ranged from endurance, like who can go longer without sleeping, to talent-based challenges, like who is the better actor, and sometimes totally ridiculous challenges, like who can piss off more people. Whoever loses the challenge would be forced to do a humiliation which was sometimes rather harmless and other times totally disgusting. It really pushed the envelope of what could be shown on cable at the time as they televised numerous crimes committed by the hosts. However, this show didn't work because of the shock value or gross out humor. It's because of the hosts' relationship. Kenny Hotz and Spencer Rice were both born and raised in Toronto and first met at 3 and 7 years old. As adults, they would move to LA together and create their first feature film, Pitch, in 1997. Unfortunately, this film would lose money and not be the career definer they hoped for. This would be a strain on their relationship, but from the chaos, Kenny came to a realization. Perhaps their fighting and conflicts could be a great source of television. See, Spenny is extremely neurotic and cares very deeply about how he's publicly perceived. Kenny is the opposite. Kenny is extremely confident, clever, and knows how to push all of Spencer's buttons. However, if nothing else, they are both extremely narcissistic. incredibly narcissistic. This dynamic would push them to create the pilot episode for Kenny vs. Spenny while in Los Angeles titled, Who Can Gain More Weight? The audience immediately saw their dynamic. Kenny cheats and steals all of Spenny's food, Spenny pushes himself too far and vomits while on a date, and Kenny bullies Spenny until he breaks and gets a friend to choke Kenny unconscious, all while Kenny laughs in his face. This pilot would get the show picked up by the CBC and it would instantly become a cult classic, though it would be dropped at the end of the first season. However, Kenny vs. Spenny fans would soon rejoice at the show being picked up by Showcase in late 2005. No longer being constrained by the CBC, Kenny vs. Spenny would immediately get more daring, their second season opening with Who Can Drink More Beer, where Kenny cheats by drinking non-alcoholic beer and Spenny binge drinks for 3 days straight. It's alarming, pathetic, and a serious spectacle for television. Over the course of the show, Kenny would become increasingly more abusive, always knowing exactly how to fool Spenny and make him look as foolish as possible. He would go so far as to dose Spenny with LSD, fake his mother's death, and forge a letter from Health Canada telling Spencer that he's contracted HIV. This would push Spenny further and further till his breaking point, ultimately destroying their friendship forever. This show was so captivating because their dynamic was real. It couldn't be replicated, though many had tried. It developed a bunch of foreign reboots who bought the concept from the Canadian original, but they all flopped because the host just didn't have the same kind of relationship Kenny and Spenny had. It was also distinctly Canadian. Aside from all the location shooting in Toronto, their dynamic itself is very representative of the Canadian culture at the time. Spenny was always worried about being polite and being seen as virtuous by the rest of the world, while Kenny didn't care and wanted to push the boundaries of televised media, both intentionally acting as two halves of what made up Canada at the time.
I think the more episodes you watched, the more you understood, how special the series was. You watch the first couple of episodes, oh, Kenny's a cheater and he's so shitty. You watch the third episode, you want Spenny crushed. You know what I mean? Because he's such a moralistic, dark fuck.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? The reality is, I'm even though I cheated and I was a scumbag that totally abused and destroyed my friend, I was actually the good guy in the end. Because to me, Kenny versus Spenny is happy versus unhappy. Mm-hmm. That's it. That's what the show is. I don't care versus I care.
The show would conclude after 6 seasons, but to this day, Kenny continues to do new reactions and commentaries of his favorite episodes, constantly boasting about how smart he is and how awful Spenny was. However, he has always paid homage to The Tom Green Show. What differentiated Kenny vs. Spenny from The Tom Green Show was that it had a plot. It wasn't just the absurd street interviews and skits. They played into a narrative which was the competition between Kenny and Spenny. Kenny vs. Spenny would also make appearances on Tom Green's podcast and do interviews, tying everything full circle. Both The Tom Green Show and Kenny vs. Spenny are unmistakably Canadian. The humor and the content matter easily reflect the nature of the Canadian media landscape at the time, and starkly differentiate from the American, more sanitized and family-friendly broadcasting. Kenny vs. Spenny and The Tom Green Show are Canada.